So the big vote is Sunday for Greece, but before all that, the World Economic Forum will wrap up in Davos. Now, earlier I spoke with Vijay, who is the China business and finance editor at The Economist, and I talked to him about what Davos thinks about the state of the global economy.
There's certainly a sense of opportunity that when we look at this year, for example, the low oil price is a dominant theme on the economic front. The opportunity that this creates for many consuming nations, China included, to take on new kinds of policies. It acts as a bit of a spur to growth around the world. At the same time, we know it's a double-edged sword. We know, for example, the potential turmoil in the Middle East, the passing of the Saudi king. There are questions about the impact of low oil prices, the sustainability of low oil prices, and what that means for Middle Eastern governments, for the geopolitics of that part of the world. So a number of the issues that are being dealt with are double-edged swords.
What about the ECB decision? I mean, that was a very big decision. We saw the market reaction. Certainly delegates there must be thinking about what the long-term implications of that might be.
This is certainly a big week for Europe. Now, the ECB decision has had its impact, but the talk in Davos has already turned to the longer term. Whatever happens in Greece in the short term, the betting is that we will probably see some form of exit, longer term, of Greece from the euro. What might a Grexit mean for the euro, for the stability of the region? What does it mean for Germany and for Chancellor Angela Merkel, who was here at Davos? And very much the concern about growth. Longer term, part of the reason Europe remains in stagnation has to do with some policies of its own making. For example, its rigid labor markets in many parts of Europe. These are the kinds of more challenging structural reforms that need to be undertaken that are still slow to get going. And so there is real concern about Europe, for sure, over the long term.
Referring to Greece, there's been some headlines most recently, perhaps giving some more confidence that the current administration there will stay in office regarding the big election coming up. There was some thought that perhaps if the opposition party were to gain extra ground, that would put essentially Greece's agreement with the IMF and the loans in jeopardy, which ultimately would put in jeopardy the entire euro. Now, are people there thinking that perhaps that everything is going to be status quo in Greece, or is there an element of perhaps uncertainty there?
I think the way to think about Greece is as follows. I think the chance in the short term of Greece leaving the euro is probably less than it was a couple of weeks ago. But over the longer term, it seems more likely. But here's the smart money. The smart money is that this is not necessarily as bad news as you might think. Compared to a couple of years ago, Europe is in a better shape to handle an exit of Greece, and Greece itself is in better position to weather departing from the comforting arms of Mother Europe. And so on both those fronts, it is probably a little bit more likely to happen now in the medium term. And guess what? It may not be the tragedy that was foreseen a couple of years ago.
The two big elephants that people usually talk about, talk briefly about China, and if you could, a little bit about the thoughts on the U.S. recovery here that seemingly seems to be picking up some ground here.
The big speech, of course, came from Premier Li Keqiang, who came to reassure a somewhat uncertain multinational corporate audience that China is still a good place to come and invest and do business. The growth figures announced officially for last year, 7.4%, the lowest in 24 years. Were not a surprise, but nevertheless, the premier made the point, which I think resonated, that, look, China is a $9–10 trillion economy. An economy this size, growing at over 7%, is contributing an enormous amount to global growth. And more than that, your investment remains welcome in China. And we have seen very important moves announced by the government in terms of a draft law on foreign investment that would make it much more attractive for foreigners, giving them equal treatment with local companies, for example, if the law comes into force for the very first time. And that's a powerful new initiative that certainly we at The Economist would like to see come to fruition.
And on the U.S. side?
People are pinning a lot of hopes on the American recovery. But there is a concern about inequality and about a kind of recovery where jobs are not producing wage growth, where companies are still largely sitting on their cash hoards, and questions being asked about confidence. And is this a real recovery that's going to have the legs so that consumers will spend and companies, and we'll see the kind of wage increases after years and years of wages being beaten down for the middle classes in America? Are we going to see a recovery in that? That's an open question mark.